And welcome back. Define American is an organization that's focused on the narrative change of employing the influence of storytelling to present immigrant narratives that are both genuine and multidimensional. They support and advocate for immigrant storytellers through community building, art, world advocacy, and their fellowship. And we've got joining us and sharing more the Director of Storyteller Support and Advocacy at Define American, Bethany Wearden. And thank you so much for being with us.
It's so fun to be here. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And when we take a look right now at immigration, a very hot topic across the United States, and we've got the migration issue happening literally as we speak. Talk to me about your perspective on where you see things with regards to immigrants right now.
Well, we think immigrants are a huge part of America. They're a sizable part of the U.S. population. But too often we see negative narratives impacting immigrant communities. And as we all know, negative narratives often lead to negative policies. In the last several years in particular, we've seen a rise in xenophobia that's leading to more difficult conditions for immigrant communities, both for immigrants who've lived here for a long time and for those that are newly arriving. So what we're trying to do is change the narrative around how we talk about immigrants. Our founder, Jose Antonio Vargas, talks about how if there are 45 million immigrants in the U.S., there are 45 million ways to be an immigrant. And we're looking to showcase that broad range of experiences.
We talk about conversations, and when it comes to immigration, those conversations can go run the gamut. We've seen it. We've seen some very damaging and demeaning conversations, almost taking the life out of immigrants as just pure human beings. And so you got to ask the question, how do I really have these conversations, humanize, and also value immigrants, particularly given the fact that we know what the conversation's like?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think a lot of it starts with, once again, allowing immigrants to be individuals and have individual stories, and shy away as much as possible from broad generalizations. Someone's story of how they came here and why they're here is going to be different from someone else's. And so if you are in a situation where someone is trying to make, broad generalizations about immigrants or immigrant communities or what they want, I think it would be helpful to ask, who do you know? Who are you talking about when you're making those broad generalizations? To have a singular person, an individual in mind, I think is helpful, as well as recognizing that all of us are fully formed human beings with wonderful things and with flaws, and allowing everyone to live in their full humanity.
For you, obviously you do a good job of humanizing, telling the story. What is it that makes the immigrant story so compelling?
That is an incredible question. So myself, I'm not an immigrant myself. I was born in the U.S. as a U.S. citizen, but spent a lot of my life living outside of the U.S. And when I moved back to the U.S. in college, I really became much more interested in stories that were coming from perspectives that I'm not usually hearing. I went to film school and I saw a lot of sort of the same kinds of stories being told that I didn't feel like reflected my own experience or the experience of many of my classmates or friends. And what I find really compelling about immigrant storytellers and why we support them is that even though they are, once again, a sizable part of the population, they're often excluded from opportunities to share their stories, from opportunities for artist support. What we do at Define American is to help give up those opportunities, both through our own fellowship programs, but also through helping other programs figure out how to be more inclusive of immigrant stories and storytellers.
When we talk about changing the narrative, obviously we want to do that, right? We want to see the narrative change with the way that sometimes immigrants are depicted, people are portrayed. You do a great job also of making sure that that work is accomplished in terms of doing things to change the narrative. So from Define America, what do you do in that cause to be able to say, listen, we want to be able to tell a different story.
Yeah, we see that both at a mass media level. So, my colleagues in the entertainment and digital storytelling consulting teams work on narratives that we see in TV and film, as well as narratives that we see on YouTube. And then in my own program, supporting individual storytellers, one of our most successful campaigns was a program called UndocuJoy, which was based on a poem by an artist, Yosemar Reyes, who was the first artist in residence at Define American. And he felt like so many narratives around being an immigrant, especially an undocumented immigrant, are trauma-based, and he wanted to really flip that on its head. And he, through this poem and the eventual video campaign, invited other undocumented individuals in the U.S. to share their joys. It had a sort of viral moment of those sharing their UndocuJoys. And that's something that we really keep central to all of our work in supporting storytellers, is that there are hard parts of their stories, but there's also really wonderful, human, loving, joyful parts of their stories as well.
If you're just joining us, we got Bethany Wearden, who's the Director of Storyteller Support and Advocacy at Define American, and she's been with us. And for somebody who may not be so familiar with the organization Define American, Bethany, a little about your history.
Yeah, we were founded in 2011 by Jose Antonio Vargas, who at the time was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who decided to come out in New York Times Magazine as undocumented. And he wasn't sure what the response to that was going to be, and a group of friends came around him in that experience and said, let's form an organization that would help others share their stories as well. And so we launched with the simple question, how do you define American? And it's since led to programs in research, entertainment, digital storytelling, journalism, and now my own work with artists.
Is there a particular story that's been told that really resonates with you that says, hey, people should know this?
That's a great question. I think for me, one of the stories that I hear often from artists that I find really moving are those who are here either undocumented or asylum seekers or refugees or others with uncertain status that are often left out of programs due to eligibility requirements based around immigration status. And I once had one of these artists tell me that she's gotten so used to being denied opportunities that she stopped applying for them or even looking for them just because of how demoralizing that is. And that's something that really stuck with me and continues to shape our work. We know that it's very difficult to be an artist and storyteller. That's not an easy career path, but I don't think that we need to make it more difficult. And often those eligibility requirements are unnecessary and are not taking into account that there are many of those living in the U.S. who do not have legal residency or do not have a social security number or work authorization, but still need to be supported as artists and storytellers.
From your perspective, what is it that probably does need to be highlighted? I mean, we know about what shouldn't be in the highlights, right? But what do we need to highlight?
Another great question. I mean, I think what we need to highlight is that immigrants are an integral part of the United States and have been since its founding. And we need to be more inclusive of immigrant communities at every level, both from just friendship levels and being welcoming to those in our neighborhoods, especially if they're newly arrived, but also being more inclusive in our policies and for organizations, nonprofits, making sure that they're considering the unique needs of immigrant communities, and at even higher levels, pushing for more inclusion of immigrant communities at all levels.
It hasn't been hard work, given the fact that we know the climate that we're in, and so many people have some real staunch views about immigrant rights, but yet and still to humanize, to tell the story, to bring that parallel, that's pretty hard work in this climate. Do you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think it is hard work, but I think it's important work. I think that it's what's necessary to be a truly multicultural, multiracial, inclusive community. And so I think that they're conversations that we need to be having. And, I think that the easiest place to start is once again like asking individuals about their individual experiences, and allowing those to be multidimensional, and allowing them to be difficult but also joyful, and fully welcoming that complex narrative.
As we look at immigration right now, are you optimistic with the way that things are going? I mean, given the fact that we know that we're talking about buses and migrant workers right now showing up across the United States, we're seeing plenty of resistance that's coming from people across the country. And at the same time, also a welcome embrace. Depending on what side of the aisle you are on, we'll see how the statistics play out. But are you optimistic that, given the fact that what we're seeing right now in our country is playing out, that immigration will get a better look?
Oh, optimism, that's a hard one. I think that I'm optimistic in the sense that we are very openly talking about immigration. I'm hoping that leads to more immigrant communities having visibility. It's definitely difficult, though, once again, as we're talking about with like the rise of xenophobia in the last few years. We want that like extra attention to be good and helpful. I think that what we can do once again at an individual level is being really mindful of including immigrants in our community decisions, being really mindful to be considering the ways that we can be more welcoming to immigrant communities, and hopefully not just get caught in the crossfire of different political opinions, but once again, like really letting people be humans and interacting as humans.
Yeah. Bethany, what are some of the ways, I mean, that we could be an ally? Because I remember during, COVID, we had Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. A lot of people said, well, how can I be an ally to communities of color, African Americans, during a time like this? And you had to get that answer from within. From within the environment of the immigrant community, what can you tell us about being that ally? What can somebody do?
That's a really great question, too. And once again, as not an immigrant myself, but coming at this as an ally, I'm not sure that I can speak for everyone. But from what I'm hearing, I think a great way to be an ally, once again, is if you are part of an organization that has eligibility policies that are currently based on immigration status. So whether that be healthcare or arts or education or something else, be considering whether those are necessary. Often there's sort of a copy paste kind of response that can happen, where it's like, oh, we've just always done things this way, without really like considering who it's impacting and how. And taking a moment to figure out if those are necessary. Can you be more inclusive of immigrant students? Can you be more inclusive of immigrant artists? Can you find ways to be providing healthcare or other social services to immigrant communities? I think that's a great way to be an ally, is to take on some of that labor of looking at your programs yourself without having someone come to you first and ask you to make the change.
I think a lot of allies were formed during the COVID pandemic, where we all just had to come together and really bear it and try to make it through. When we talk about COVID, a huge impact, I would assume, for the immigrant community. I won't just say assume, I know. I've had conversations and interviews before. But from your boots on the ground and from your bird's eye view, how did you see COVID playing out for the immigrant community?
Yeah, I think we saw this really split narrative, where we saw lots of hateful words and hateful actions leading to xenophobic actions against immigrant communities, while at the same time we saw this really helpful and positive narrative that was highlighting how many immigrants are part of frontline workers, immigrant healthcare workers, immigrant farm workers, immigrant teachers, all of these individuals that were really responding to the pandemic even while being often very far from their own families and maybe not being able to travel to see them. And so I think that, coming out of the pandemic, there's sort of this uh, dissonance that's left. But once again, of those two different narratives, on the one hand, really celebrating the work of immigrant frontline workers, but then also this really nasty history of xenophobic rhetoric and actions.
You yourself are, literally those one of many that are out there in terms of support and a resource. I think the biggest challenge that a lot of people faced during that time is that it further exacerbated the lack of access to resources that people didn't have. You got you have this pandemic going on, and you've got people out there on the front lines saying, "Listen, we are trying to access resources," and now hearing those in the immigrant community, they're saying, "COVID just made it further, shine a light further on the fact of access to resources and the disparities that exist."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my work with artists and storytellers in particular, I think that we saw the way that the pandemic was difficult for artists and storytellers across the board. There's an organization, Artist Relief, that did a survey and found that something like 90% of artists lost income during the pandemic due to not being able to perform or exhibit or things like that. And in some ways, that was a really bonding experience for artists across different backgrounds. Many of the programs that had currently had exclusionary immigration status requirements with them dropped those during COVID, which was really wonderful. And I think, as we're coming out of that time, I'm hoping that we can bring some of that bonding and solidarity with us. Once again, the sort of at a very human level, the way that we can be supporting one another and be inclusive all the time, even when it's not, a sort of once in a history pandemic.
For people who want to find out ways that they could be an ally and really support the work of Define American and the work that you've got going on, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, you can find our website at defineamerican.com. We publish all of our research reports and inclusive guides and recommendations for how to work with immigrant storytellers, all on our website. You can also follow us on Instagram at Define American, where we share sort of bite-sized resources as well as profiles of different immigrant artists and change makers. And then if you have any more questions or want to talk about any of this in more detail, feel free to email me, Bethany at defineamerican.com.
Well, Bethany, certainly we want to thank you for joining us. And as we look forward towards the summer, anything that you want our viewers to know about to look out for and to watch out for?
Oh, that's fun. We have some exciting Instagram profiles coming out soon of some artists, immigrant artists that you want to take a look at. And then also, we, in addition to our fellowship program, do immigrant storyteller gatherings around the country, and you can find out more information about that on our website and Instagram as well. Maybe there'll be one coming to your city soon.
All right. Well, Bethany Wearden, we want to thank you so much for being with us. She is the Director of Storyteller Support and Advocacy for Define American. And glad to have you. Glad to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here.
All righty. Well, it's an honor to have you. We are taking a quick break. We want you to stay with us. We'll be right back after this.